This film begins in an office where we see a female employee taking a letter from the table with her hands tied like a prisoner. She is being punished by her boss, but to understand this situation we have to go back 6 months. Her name is Lee, a woman with a tendency to self-harm who was discharged from the hospital today. In fact, she was reluctant to go home because living in an institution was easier for her, but it turns out the doctor has his own considerations, so this might be a good start for her life. After arriving home, she was greeted by the excitement of her sister's wedding party, and she immediately joined the guests in dancing with her former high school friend, Peter. Unfortunately, her happiness didn't last long, because when she found out that her father still liked to drink, she was mentally triggered. As a result, she ran into her room while annoyed and then hurt herself with strange objects which showed that she hadn't changed at all. However, at least she still wants to build her life, and this is proven by her efforts to take a typing course for a typewriter that she can master well. Lee revealed that she had been doing strange behavior since grade 7, until one day when she was in the kitchen with her mother, she was caught cutting the skin on her own hand. So now, in order to prevent her from returning to her bad behavior, her mother hides all sharp objects in their house. What was interesting for her that night was that she found an old newspaper where there were several job vacancy advertisements, but she chose only one, namely as a secretary for a lawyer. And the next day, when it was raining heavily, Lee was taken by her mother to apply for the job. She then entered the office where she found something strange looking at the messy situation, and there was an employee who had gone to pack up her things. The investigation led her to a room where she met the lawyer she was looking for, Mr. Gray, who apparently also had strange behavior. He immediately interviewed her by asking her some personal questions, which she was good at answering. He explained that the job he was offered would be very boring, but she didn't mind that. After seeing Lee's seriousness in her intention to work, Mr. Gray finally accepted her as his secretary, and her job was to write letters to potential clients and take telephone calls. In the days she worked, at first everything seemed normal, and Mr. Gray really liked Lee's deftness in handling tasks. However, the longer she worked in the office, Mr. Gray's strange behavior became increasingly dominant and intimidating to Lee. He asked Lee to take his client's case notes, which he accidentally threw in the trash, but after she took them, Mr. Gray asked her to throw them away again. After that, he asked Lee to update the bait in the mousetrap in his room, and here he announced that Lee had a secret after he saw the plaster of small wounds on her thigh. At one point, Lee's father called her on a public telephone for unknown reasons, and he left the phone without hanging up. As a result, Lee became frustrated and rudely hung up the phone, and then took strange items that she usually used to injure herself. When that happened, Mr. Gray was watching her, making her so embarrassed that she couldn't say anything. The next day, Lee, who had a day off, decided to have dinner with Peter at the laundry place. Nostalgic chats with old friends explode, and here it is revealed that it turns out they like each other, which they prove by sharing a kiss. Unbeknownst to Lee, Mr. Gray, who happened to be there, had once again discovered his private affairs, and for some reason, this time he looked very angry. The next day at the office, Mr. Gray scolds Lee for a spelling mistake in the letter she typed, so he asks her to correct it because it concerns his reputation with the client. However, even though she had corrected it, it turned out that there were still spelling errors that Mr. Gray found, making Lee frustrated because of her own actions. Apart from correcting the spelling of letters, Mr. Gray also asked Lee to change the way she dressed, and most importantly, he didn't like hearing Lee sniffle. On the other hand, Lee's relationship with Peter became increasingly serious, and his parents started talking about marriage. Meanwhile, Mr. Gray, realizing that there is something strange with Lee, asks her to talk openly to him about the problems she is facing. He gives her advice to stop hurting herself, and tells her to start a new, healthier life, making Lee seem comfortable with his guidance, making Lee believe that Mr. Gray has accepted her as she is. Unfortunately, Lee's peace with Mr. Gray didn't last long because the next day she was scolded for a mistake she usually made, a grammatical error. Initially, he only intended to reprimand her, but because she was heard sniffling again, she was asked to come to his office with the letter she had written. Mr. Gray ordered her to bend over his desk while reading aloud the letter she had written while he slapped her on the back as punishment, and the woman seemed to be enjoying it rather than being in pain, perhaps. After this punishment, Lee asked her mother not to worry about sharp objects at home anymore, and she also dared to throw away her strange things. It turned out that she had prepared a plan, namely that she deliberately let Mr. Gray punish her as a substitute for her strange behavior. She was willing to be treated like one, too, until she let Mr. Gray regulate her diet. However, their relationship actually became closer because it seemed that Mr. Gray also enjoyed punishing her, and this had a serious impact on Lee, who started to fall in love with him. In her solitude, sometimes she imagines Mr. Gray just to satisfy her lust, and at the same time she tries to forget Peter because she doesn't get satisfaction from him. The next day, Lee received bad news from the hospital that her father was in intensive care because his health was deteriorating, making her very sad. That's why she went to see Mr. Gray to tell her story, but for some reason she couldn't convey her sadness properly, and Mr. Gray immediately asked her to leave. This also had an impact on the next day at the office, where Mr. Gray no longer wanted to punish her for the mistakes she had made. Several times she tried to provoke his anger by causing various problems, but Mr. Gray just treated her like a normal secretary. She was so frustrated that she experimented with spanking herself, but she didn't feel the pleasure she got from Mr. Gray. She tried to do it with Peter, but he became too soft and Lee didn't like it. Hi. Before we continue the story, make sure you have pressed the subscribe button. Thank you. Therefore, she took a large worm and put it in the letter she gave to Mr. Gray. How annoyed he was when he saw the big worm because this was completely out of bounds. He immediately asked Lee to come to his office and then told her to bend over and take off her skirt. However, it turns out that this time he punished her in a different way, namely by only making her his masturbation material. After the punishment was over, Lee came out of his office feeling confused and happy at the same time because she finally got confirmation from Mr. Gray, his desires about her. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Gray actually really regretted what he had done and considered it a big mistake. The next day, he fired Lee as his secretary and placed all the blame on her. He said bad things about her while she was working, then gave her her last paycheck and asked her to leave. Lee is clearly saddened by this sudden decision because what she imagined about him is now shattered. She feels dumped. But she didn't tell her parents that she had been fired from her job, and she always pretended to go to work from home just to see the new secretary across the street. After several days passed, she decided to move on and look for a man who loved her. Everyone was somehow too crazy for her until she decided to stop looking and take the time to care for her father. One day, she decided to accept Peter's proposal, and they got married the next day. In fact, she could never forget Mr. Gray, so she ran away from home to his office and confessed her love to him. Unfortunately, he didn't believe her, so he forced her to put both hands on the table and told her to wait until he came back. When night fell, Mr. Gray tested her obedience by calling the telephone in his office, and how shocked he was when he saw Lee pick up the phone with her teeth, making him believe that she really loved him. A few minutes later, Peter comes to get her, but she hits him and goes back to the table. She insists that she doesn't want him and asks him to leave. The next day, she was still sitting there without eating or drinking. Many people came to persuade her to go home, but she didn't want to leave until Mr. Gray asked her to. On the third day, outside the office building began to become crowded with people and journalists who witnessed Lee's strange actions. After much consideration, Mr. Gray finally thought that Lee was a worthy woman, so he went straight to his office, gave her a drink, took her to a secret room, then made love to her. A few days passed, Mr. Gray decided to invite Lee to live with him, and a few months later, they got married and started going on new adventures together.